Okay, everybody, we are going to go ahead and get started. I know there's a couple of you still getting into the webinar, but just take your time and come on all the way in. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We're so excited to have you at our weekly Parsec webinar. It's a fantastic time to hang out with everybody and learn new things. So we're glad you could be here with us. I want to give you a reminder for today that our webinars are interactive. So please feel free to be on camera, hang out, interact, come off mute when there's time to have discussions and answer questions or ask questions. And be sure to use your chat because we love having dialogue here. So be present and be a part. We would love to hear your thoughts. I want to take a moment to talk about what we've got coming up. We will have part 2 of this amazing series next week. So mark your calendars now with a reminder so that the work we start today, we can finish next week. And welcome back from your holidays, friends. We don't have one from last week because obviously you guys were all off and we were off. I hope you got to do some relaxing things and just refresh a little bit. Today, we're excited to be talking about what happens when we ignore students' home languages and their identities connected to them. This two-part session explains these problems and offers research-based ways to create classrooms that value students' voices, cultures, and strengths. And part 1 today introduces the key issues and shows how changes in policy, teaching, and daily practice can build more welcoming and effective learning environments. We are so excited to be joined today by Francisca Sanchez, who is the founder and owner of Provocative Practice, a California-based company focused on supporting schools and districts in creating systems of high-quality education for California students, and in particular, for its students of color and English learners. And this includes a substantial investment in the development and application of research-informed, high-leverage approaches, practices, models, and programs designed to achieve sustainable and dramatically improved 21st century student results. Thank you so much for coming, Francisca, and we're very excited today to talk about unsilencing students' languages. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and let you take over because I know you have a lot of amazing content and everyone here is excited to hear about it.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, get those slides up. Are we good? Are people able to see the slides? Great. Okay, well, I want to welcome everyone to this session on unsilencing language. I'm Francisca Sanchez, and I've been actively working on issues related to language and language minority students for over 40 years at a variety of levels, including school districts, county offices, and even a short stint at the California Department of Education. Currently, I'm working as a consultant and advisor to school districts and other organizations, both on issues of pedagogy and practice and on how they can design student-centered strategic plans that actually incorporate all the things that we'll be talking about today. So I just want to note before we get started that I have a QR code on the screen. I'll show that again at the end, but if you access that, that QR code will actually take you to a Google Drive folder that has just tons of related resources, including a variety of different slide decks of different lengths on this topic. And then later today, I'll add this particular slide deck to that too. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. As many of you know, there is a quite lengthy history around the educational research that documents some of the devastating impacts of subtractive language policies, pedagogies, and practices on our students, their families, and their communities. And often the result is that this renders their languages, their cultures, their voices, their strengths invisible and silenced. This session will share what we know about the social, the emotional, the academic, and linguistic negative impacts of such policies and practices. And we'll propose that districts create what I'm calling an ecology of learning that centers students and that valorizes their languages and their identities. Because when we do that, we're able to set the foundation for powerful education that really is responsive to the unlimited potential of each student, and that has the capacity to transform those negative experiences that result from silencing language into long-term and sustainable success for the students, for their families, and their communities. And I guess we can start by just acknowledging that our voices, our identities, our languages, our cultures, these are all really important assets in helping us find our way in the world as powerful and creative global citizens. Too often, however, our students are experiencing subtractive and reductionist educational policies that leave them devastated. And these policies not only strip our students of their language and culture, which of course are two vital assets in healthy identity formation, but they also preclude them from engaging fully in the broader curriculum in school life, all of which can provide them with tools and avenues for exploring who they are and how they are in the world. So this work really challenges us to take responsibility for disrupting colonizing paradigms in our classrooms and in our schools so that our students are able to fully develop their linguistic, cultural, academic, and artistic potentials. And in that process, claim their voices. And as I consider us humane, evolved leaders, we, I think, have a special responsibility to actively unsilence the language of our students. So I'll start by just saying a little bit about what I mean about the ecology of learning. That's the framework that I want you to think about. So I'm approaching this work from the perspective of this holistic framework that views learning as a complex system, a system that encompasses the individual, their social and cultural environments, the physical world, and then the dynamic interactions among them. And the framework suggests that learning isn't an isolated process, but is profoundly shaped by the physical, social, and cultural, including language contexts, the ecology that is in which it happens, including resources, relationships, and institutional cultures. This means that we have to keep in mind that in shaping the optimal learning environments for our students, context does matter, that powerful learning is interconnected, active, and distributed, that learning ecologies evolve over time, constantly changing and adapting, and that from a broader perspective, this does include understanding how people learn and how those learning processes influence their interactions with the physical world. In other words, our learning environments, by design, should support our students' physical, social, emotional, linguistic, cultural, and intellectual safety, growth, and stimulation. So that's where we're starting. And because of that, we've set up three big goals for this session and next week's session. So we want to make sure that we can expand our understanding of how students' languages are silenced through the policies, pedagogies, and practices that we support in our schools and the consequences of that silencing. We want to be able to engage with strategies for transforming learning environments so they actively center students' languages and valorize their identities as key vehicles for ensuring their school and life success. And we want to, as time permits, explore examples of policies, pedagogies, practices, and resources to help support the transformation of their classrooms, their schools, their districts into affirming learning environments that really do center their voices and potentials. So we're going to divide up this talk as we said earlier, into two parts. And the plan is that we're going to start by listening to some of the experiences that people have had with their language being silenced and use that to help us understand a bit about the consequences of silencing languages and what that implies for our own work. So we'll end part one by introducing what we can do to unsilence students' languages by centering them and their voices. Then in part two, we'll get into more depth about how we can actually create and enact these types of policies, pedagogies, and practices. Policies, for example, that create this ecology or help us create this ecology of affirming student centered learning. We'll finish part two by reflecting on what we can do beyond this two-part session with a focus on identifying one or two actions that we can each take in our own settings to make a difference. So, with that, as I said, let's start by reading some excerpts from actual testimonies about the impact of losing one's language, impact that goes far beyond our classrooms. So you have, I think, a link in the chat. Maybe we shared a link to a handout that contains six excerpts. So would you please just select one of the excerpts of the six, take a moment to reflect on what stands out to you about your selected quote and perhaps an aha you're experiencing or an insight that's emerging. And then we'll give you a minute or two to do that. And then I'll ask a few of you to share your quote and one highlight perhaps of your reflection. So take a minute or two now to do that. Maybe another 30 seconds. Okay, I'm going to ask you to join us again. Just, it's hard for me to see everybody that's on. So maybe if you have something to share, share your quote and then give us just a highlight or two of the things that are coming to your mind. Just go ahead and jump into the call.
Okay, this is Dr. Yufandu from Palmdale School District. Looking at number 6, through language, we say things, we think things, we become things. And when we are essentially closed off from our heritage languages, we are also closed off from what we may have been able to become. We lose more than just words. You know, that one rang very close to me. I'm from Nigeria and I had all my kids here. So when they were growing up, we spoke English. So they ended up, only my first child was able to understand my language well and speak it well. Because by the time the second child comes in, they go to school, they speak English. So most of the time they just go towards that English. But as they got older, they lost part of the language, but they are now yearning, trying to get back to it, to learn it, to have it,
Yeah.
because it's a part of them. It makes them belong. And when they are out there with other folks, other families, when they speak that language, it gives them that sense of comfort that they can understand each other and they can really interact in that
Yes.
language. So I think it's very powerful. You can't just lose it. It,
Right.
it makes you whole in that
Thank you.
aspect.
Thank you, Francis. Is there someone else who'd like to share?
I can go.
Mhm.
I agree with, I also agree with Francis in the idea of taking my nieces and nephews back to Mexico, or we've even visited Colombia, and their experience, it's lost so much because they don't speak the language, as well as potentially myself. I had my best friend with me, my father. We got so much more out of those experiences than they do because their language, they're not speaking the same way,
Mhm.
and therefore tend to talk to each other versus getting to know new people. I feel that would be different if they had a better understanding of the language.
Yeah. Thank you. Maybe one more person?
I like to share a part of three, as it doesn't feel like the sudden sharp pain of losing someone you love, but rather a dull ache that builds slowly until it becomes a part of you. And I think that part made me think of two things. One, as kids are growing and developing, they don't recognize the loss that they have, right? It's those small instances with family, with friends, that they begin to realize they're lacking something. But also, as Frances mentioned with her second child, right? Typically, that first child is the one that speaks that home language the best.
Yeah.
But through time, and through kids, they have less and less, right?
Mhm.
And we have students who come into kindergarten fluent in their home language, and by the time
Yeah.
they leave elementary, they're really lacking in that home language, and English has taken over. But they don't recognize it until you have a big family event and realize you're having communication blocks, right? It doesn't feel like a sharp thing that happens instantly, but it's rather dull and sometimes goes unnoticed until it's almost too late.
Yeah, it's a very insidious process, and often the younger children are feeling something about this, but they don't yet have the language to put a name to it. So keep these quotes in mind. Keep what you experienced as you read them in mind as we talk a little bit more about how it is that we silence language, and it is not always, and in our case now, not usually in an explicit way, but it doesn't really matter. The consequences is very similar. So let me talk a little bit about um, how it is that over time we have silenced languages in this country. And as I'm talking about these, think about examples that come to your mind, either from your own family history, from situation with your children, your own situation, whatever it might be, or what you've observed in your own schools and classrooms. And I'll just start by saying that the first and probably one of the most effective ways of killing a language doesn't really happen in the US now, although it's still happening in other parts of the world. And that strategy is to just kill the speakers of the language. And of course, with this strategy, you don't have to worry about targeting language specifically. It's only necessary to destroy the speakers of that language, and the language dies with them. The second strategy was official U.S. policy at one time and not that long ago. Reservations are a clear example, as are the Indian boarding schools. And in case we think that these things are in our remote past somewhere, we can note that these horrific boarding schools were not officially dismantled until the mid to late 1970s. And more recently, there have been efforts to document and mitigate their lingering impacts on Indigenous children and their families. So it's not something that's way, way, way back in our history. The effects are still with us. Strategy number three was a prevailing strategy with many communities, including with enslaved peoples, where the penalty for violating these laws was often death. But at various times in our history, there have been laws enacted that banned a variety of languages such as German, Hawaiian, Spanish, Cajun French, and even sign language. And the strategy is still very much alive and well, including the most recent presidential resolution and other English only efforts. So you know you're familiar with that. I would say that to these three strategies, which are pretty overt strategies, that we can add a fourth, more contemporary, perhaps more sophisticated strategy that plays out particularly effectively in the education arena, and that is acknowledge the languages and the speakers, but downplay, marginalize, and devalue their centrality and their importance. And on its face, it seems a less brutal strategy, but it's just as effective in its results as other more visibly violent strategies. And we can see this strategy at work every day in our schools. Policymakers, for example, acknowledge that we should be responsive to students' cultures, and sometimes they even say languages. Their vision statements often make reference to diversity. They even offer, in some cases, dual language programs. Yet, very infrequently do these policies center students' languages as a fundamental human right. Very infrequently do they establish programs of sufficient quality, quantity, or extent to make sure that every student receives formal instruction in and through their home languages. And very infrequently do they provide the resources to support full development of students' languages and their multilingual repertoires. So when this is what happens, we don't have to explicitly silence students' languages. It happens logically and predictably as a result of policies and practices that simply ignore these languages or undervalue them. The normalization of English monolingualism requires that multilingualism be seen as something unusual, exotic, not essential, or maybe even just irrelevant. And both students and parents learn this lesson very well. It's important to recognize the intentionality of such subtractive policies. As one informant noted, and I'm quoting here, breaking the connection with language seems to be a tried and tested technique of colonizers. And it's not something that arises out of benign neglect or a better language coming along. It's not the result of a neutral kind of Darwinism, survival of the fittest. Language loss often results from the abuse of language speakers and the destruction of cultural practices as an intentional severing. And this might make you think back to a couple of those quotes you read that emphasize that severing aspect. So, if this is how we silence languages, what are the consequences? What are the impacts, not just for us, but of course for our children and their families? So they do bring with them a multiplicity of generational consequences, including trauma, disruption, destruction, and disadvantage. And they affect not only the targeted individuals on a personal level, but their families, their communities, and even the larger national and global world. So for means of just illustrating, we're going to focus just on the personal level right now and what happens to the child. There's absolutely no doubt that the silencing of children's language causes deep personal trauma to the children themselves. And this trauma plays out in the children as a sense of isolation, of confusion, and very often of shame. Of course, at a minimum, it also results in language atrophy and very often in language loss. And some of you mentioned that. Furthermore, there really is a significant body of research and evidence that when students are denied the opportunity to fully develop their home languages, they suffer academically and cognitively. So together, these traumas produce children whose sense of belonging and connection, their self-confidence, their sense of agency are all eroded. Of course, this also affects families and communities. It limits communication, it severs community bonds, it weakens group identity, and the consequences then spill out to our creativity and knowledge creation at the national level. So these are really huge consequences. We have, by the way, I'll just say that we also need to think about the students who speak what we call non-standard dialects. For example, our Black students who speak African American vernacular English suffer many of the same consequences. And we have testimonies from African American students who experience the same pain. And connected to that, we have lots of ideas, mostly wrong, by the way, about what's proper or correct language, about what's valid language and what's not. And it's important to know that from a linguistic point of view, all languages are equally valid and rule governed, even if we don't see what those rules are. What we consider standard is standard only because it's the language of those in power, those who get to define what's valid and what's not. As the saying goes, the only difference between a language and a dialect is that the language has an army behind it. So we can think of the consequences of silencing and killing languages as a sort of fractal, a pattern that repeats over and over again. And like with fractals in nature, we can see the individual effects of silencing languages as those effects then bloom and iterate in increasingly larger and more consequential ways within families, within communities, and across the world. So we're going to take a moment right now just to have you reflect a bit on what's been shared so far, what stands out to you as an aha you're experiencing or an insight that's emerging. How does language silencing play out in your own local community? So give you just a minute to think about that. Maybe another 30 seconds. Okay, I'm not going to have you share out just because of the time, but I do want you to think about this and consider what's happening in your own communities and how what's happening either confirms the things I've been sharing, or maybe it doesn't, and maybe we need to talk about that in our next session. I'll just say that we can do something about this. There is a way forward, but it really requires us shifting and expanding our understanding of language and its relation to everything. Language is such an intimate thing. It's the language, our own languages are the language of our first and closest interactions with those that we love and those who love us. And for many of our students, they do experience this very shocking and confusing and disruption when they enter school, where the only language they know and understand disappears. So I've come up with an acronym that can help us remember that revitalizing our languages can actually be a radical act of healing and repair, not only for our classrooms, but for our world. And this acronym is CREATE, and it talks about 6 core actions that we should consider as we move forward. Starting with creating additive language policies that center our children's languages and cultures, beginning to re-envision multilingualism as a vital national and global resource that's directly connected to the health of our planet, enlisting our diverse language families and communities in the co-design process with us, adopting a set of affirming pedagogical principles to guide our work, transforming our practice in research-informed ways that then enact that new vision and those principles, and engaging community funds of knowledge as well as research allies and other partners in this work. And when we come back next time, we're going to focus on 3 of these areas specifically. So as you go back to your communities and to your work, just think about what's happening in your own schools with regard to languages, what's happening with students, with families, with staff, and see if you can come up with some examples, concrete examples in the 3 areas I've mentioned: policy, pedagogy, and practice. And so that either support the silencing of students' languages or affirm their languages. And then we'll try to pair that with what we talk about next time. So in closing, I just want to let you know again that there is this Google Drive folder that has so many resources for you if this is an area that you're interested in. And you can go directly to the QR code. If you have problems with it, just email me directly and I'll connect you up. And I want to just thank you so much for your attention and for being part of our session. And I'll stop sharing and turn this back over to Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Francisco. That was wonderful. I don't know about you guys, but Now we have homework and we all got to come back next week. I like it though when I get a little bit of homework. It makes me think. So thank you so much for bringing that to us, for talking us through everything today. I'm very excited about next week's webinar. I hope all of you will come back and join us for that. If you have any questions or need anything, you can always email Parsec at helloparsec, and we will of course be following up this webinar with the resources and the recording, so you can get on that homework for
Yeah.
next week.
And can I just jump in? I think Robert put in the chat the link to a conference that we're sponsoring in February that is going to address these and many other issues. And we really, really encourage you to register and to invite your colleagues to register as well.
Yes, great. Thank you all for joining us today. We will see you next week, and look for that follow-up email because I'm expecting your homework.
All right.
Bye,
Thank
friends.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.